Hello, everyone. I'm Mohammed Baig from Brown University. I'm a preventive cardiology fellow, and with me is Dr. Mikhail Kosiborod from St. Luke's Mid America Heart Institute, Kansas City, Missouri. Thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Good to be with you.
So, will you tell us about your research trial, EMPULSE? And I know it's about Empagliflozin and seeing the outcomes in heart failure.
Yeah, so EMPULSE is a trial of empagliflozin SGLT2 inhibitor in patients hospitalized with acute heart failure. And it included all patients with acute heart failure, regardless of whether they did or did not have diabetes, whether they had reduced or preserved ejection fraction, and also whether they had worsening chronic heart failure or de novo heart failure. And we presented the main results of the trial at the American Heart Association last year, where we showed that empagliflozin significantly improved the total clinical benefit using an endpoint that combines death, heart failure events, and change in Kansas City Cardiomyopathy Questionnaire, which is a measure of patient symptoms, physical limitations, and quality of life. That empagliflozin significantly improved that outcome as compared with placebo. In this analysis that we are presenting at the American College of Cardiology Congress, we are specifically looking at effects of empagliflozin on the outcomes of KCCQ, across all of the domains of KCCQ, so including symptoms, physical limitations, quality of life, and a time course of those effects.
Thank you. And did you find an improvement in all the domains of KCCQ?
Right, so we had two main objectives in the study. First is to understand whether the total clinical benefit in a trial differed at all based on degree of symptomatic impairment at baseline as measured by KCCQ. And second is to look at those domains of KCCQ over time. And essentially what we found is, number one, patients benefited from empagliflozin in terms of total clinical benefit regardless of how severe their symptoms were at baseline. And second, and perhaps most interestingly, what we found is that empagliflozin significantly improved all of the domains of KCCQ, including all of the key domains, including symptoms, physical limitations, quality of life, and all the summary domains, the clinical summary score, overall summary score. And it did so as early as 15 days after randomization, so very rapidly. And those benefits were sustained for up to 90 days. So I think the bottom line kind of take-home message is if you initiate SGLT2 inhibition in a hospital for patients with acute heart failure, you see a benefit within 15 days of starting the medication, which is very rapid improvement.
Thank you. That's amazing. Like just seeing the improvement just after 15 days after initiation of empagliflozin is impressive. I was just curious about how much was the improvement, like point estimate wise, could you tell us?
Yeah, so let's pick, for example, total symptom score, which is a measure of the symptom burden in this patient population, which of course is very symptomatic at baseline because they're in a hospital with heart failure. So within 15 days, we saw greater than 5-point improvement in total symptom score with empagliflozin as compared with placebo. Now, it is important to keep in mind that because these are patients that are in the hospital, once they're discharged, generally their health status, their symptom burden, physical limitations get better very quickly because obviously received a lot of intensive treatments in the hospital, right? So showing a benefit on top of this general improvement is not very easy, but despite that, we see more than 5-point difference in favor of empagliflozin as compared to placebo in symptom burden, for example, as early as 15 days. So again, it's a statistically significant but also a clinically meaningful improvement that we see in this patient population.
That's great. And I was thinking about the study duration of 90 days. Do you think, like, if the study was extended to more than 90 days, let's say 6 months or 12 months, would you have seen greater improvement?
Yeah, so generally what we see, so the trial follow-up was only 90 days, right? So we don't know what happens after 90 days. But I would argue that follow-up is highly relevant to people that are in the hospital. Because you want to make sure that you improve outcomes as quickly as possible, following hospitalization, because the event rate is very high in this patient population, the symptom burden is very high as well. So what we can say based on our results is that once you accumulate that benefit, it's sustained at a relatively stable level through 90 days. So there is no attenuation of benefit over time. And if you look at other trials, so once patients have passed 90 days, they start transitioning from this kind of acute, subacute phase to more of a chronic phase, and certainly transition to chronic phase after 6 months. And for that, we can look at chronic heart failure trials with SGLT2 inhibitors. And we know that in populations of patients with chronic heart failure, whether reduced or preserved ejection fraction, these agents also improve health status. So I think it's a reasonable extrapolation to say we now have evidence that they acutely improve these outcomes in a short term after hospitalization and also in the chronic populations. They improve those outcomes. Like in DAPA-HF, for example, we saw outcomes up to 8 months, outcomes in terms of symptoms, physical limitations, quality of life, better with SGLT2 inhibitors at 8 months as compared with placebo in a chronic setting. So I think while in our trial we didn't follow beyond 90 days, it's highly likely, based on what we know in the chronic populations, that those benefits would still be seen longer term.
That's great. One last question. What was the proportion of heart failure subtypes in your study trial? Like, were there more HFrEF versus HFpEF?
Right. So in this particular study, about 2/3 of the patients had reduced ejection fraction, and a third had preserved ejection fraction. And there was absolutely no difference in the benefit in terms of improvements in symptoms, physical limitations, and quality of life by ejection fraction. So both patients with reduced EF and preserved EF had statistically similar benefits with empagliflozin as compared with placebo.
Thank you so much for being with us, and thank you for watching. For videos like these, please go to the YouTube channel Fits on the Go.